The 17th of January 1943. 2:47 a.m. Over the Solomon Sea. The night was absolute. No moon, no stars. Only the mechanical drone of a Mitsubishi G4M bomber cutting through tropical darkness at 11,000 feet, its twin engines labouring against humid air thick enough to taste. Inside the cockpit, Lieutenant Takeshi Yamamoto adjusted his goggles against the instrument glow faint green phosphorescence that turned his face into a floating mask. Below him, somewhere in that ink-black void, the jungle-covered ridges of Guadalcanal slept beneath clouds that had swallowed the world whole. He checked his chronometer. 14 minutes to target. 14 minutes to drop his payload on the American airfield at Henderson Field, then vanish back into the protective darkness that had shielded Japanese night bombers for 18 months of war. Yamamoto permitted himself a thin smile. The Americans might own the daylight now, but the night still belonged to the Emperor's Eagles. He never saw the Grumman F-6F Hellcat climbing through the cloud deck 3,000 feet below him. Its pilot's eyes locked not on the darkness ahead, but on a glowing green scope mounted to his instrument panel, watching a bright pip crawl across the screen like a luminous insect. The American pilot's thumb rested on the firing button. His engine was throttled back to near silence. He was hunting not by sight or sound or intuition, but by invisible fingers of electromagnetic energy reaching out through the night, touching his prey, and whispering back its exact location. The radar scope pulsed. The pip grew brighter. 1,000 yards, 800, 600. Yamamoto's first indication that the night had betrayed him was the tracer rounds that seemed to materialize from empty space itself. Brilliant orange lines stitching across his starboard wing, punching through aluminum skin, detonating his fuel tank into a flower of yellow flame that turned darkness into noon for exactly 3 seconds before the bomber began its terminal spiral toward the black water below. In those final moments, as centrifugal force pressed him against his harness and the flames began eating through the cockpit floor, Yamamoto understood with perfect crystalline clarity that he had been killed by something he could not see, could not hear, could not comprehend. The Americans had learned to see in the dark, and they had told no one. For 20 months, the mathematics of night combat in the Pacific had been written in Japanese ink. Since the opening salvos at Pearl Harbor, through the conquest of the Philippines, the fall of Singapore, the savage air battles over Java and New Guinea, one immutable truth had governed aerial warfare after sunset. The side that could operate in darkness owned the battlefield. Japanese aviators, trained in the brutal crucible of combat over China, had mastered the art of nocturnal navigation through techniques the Americans could barely comprehend: celestial navigation by star patterns memorized in childhood, dead reckoning calculations performed without instruments, the ability to judge altitude by air pressure felt through semicircular canals in the inner ear. They flew on moonless nights with the confidence of men navigating their own gardens, dropping bombs on targets they had memorized from maps, attacking convoys they located by the faint phosphorescent wakes of ships through tropical waters. The Americans, by contrast, stumbled through darkness like blind men in a forest. U.S. Army, Air Force, and Navy pilots, trained in the safety-conscious methodology of instrument flight and radio navigation, found themselves paralyzed when those technological crutches were stripped away. Radio silence was mandatory near combat zones. Instrument panels could be seen from miles away by sharp-eyed Japanese observers. Navigation lights were suicidal. Throughout 1942, American forces in the South Pacific endured a nightly purgatory of Japanese bombing raids that arrived with predictable regularity. The washing machine Charlie runs that denied sleep, destroyed aircraft on the ground, turned forward airfields into cratered moonscapes. The Americans could do nothing but dig deeper into their foxholes and curse the darkness that shielded their tormentors. Japanese naval aviators called these missions Yurei Hiko ghost flights. They would launch from Rabaul or Bougainville in loose formations, navigate by the Southern Cross and Scorpius, arrive over American positions with uncanny precision, deliver their ordnance, and dissolve back into equatorial night before dawn could expose them to the swarms of American fighters that ruled daylight skies. It was psychological warfare as much as material destruction, the constant reminder that Japanese technical skill and warrior spirit could penetrate any defense, strike any target, disappear without consequence. In officers' clubs from Espiritu Santo to Brisbane, American pilots drank their frustration into numb silence and wondered how you fought an enemy who could see in conditions where vision itself became meaningless. What the Japanese pilots expected was a war of attrition they would inevitably win. Their night navigation skills had been honed over decades. Their aircraft, the G-4M bombers, nicknamed Betty by the Americans, the A-6M0 fighters, the D-3A dive bombers, had been designed from their first blueprints to operate in conditions of minimal visibility. Japanese cockpit instruments used dim red lighting that preserved night vision. Their formation techniques emphasized wide spacing and individual navigation rather than formation keeping. Their training programs subjected student pilots to hundreds of hours of nighttime flight instruction, solo navigation exercises over featureless ocean, emergency procedures practiced in total darkness. This was Bushido applied to aviation victory through superior discipline, superior spirit, superior acceptance of hardship that would break lesser men. What they encountered instead was the weaponization of a principle of physics they did not know existed. The story of airborne radar begins not in the Pacific, but in the grey skies over Britain, where in 1940, a desperate nation transformed a laboratory curiosity into an instrument of survival. British scientists, racing against the Luftwaffe's nightly dismemberment of London, had developed the chain-home system crude ground-based radar stations that gave Fighter Command precious minutes of warning before German bombers reached English cities. But ground-based radar could only see so far, limited by the curvature of the Earth, defeated by low-flying aircraft that hugged the terrain. What the British needed, what they achieved through 18 months of frantic development, was radar compact enough to fit inside an aircraft fuselage, sensitive enough to detect another aircraft at useful range, simple enough for a combat pilot to interpret while simultaneously flying and fighting. By late 1941, British night fighters equipped with airborne interception radar were killing German bombers at a rate that transformed the Battle of Britain from a war of attrition into a German strategic defeat. The Americans, watching from across the Atlantic with a mixture of admiration and skepticism, began their own parallel development. Bell Laboratories, Westinghouse, MIT's radiation laboratory institutions that had spent decades refining radio technology for commercial broadcasting were suddenly retasked toward military applications with unlimited funding and presidential mandate. What emerged was the SCR-720 radar system, a transmitter, receiver, and display scope that could detect aircraft-sized targets at ranges approaching 5 miles, display their position on a cathode ray tube, and guide a fighter pilot through intercept geometry he could not see with his eyes. The Japanese knew none of this. Their intelligence services, stretched thin across an empire spanning a quarter of the globe, focused on conventional military indicators, ship movements, troop concentrations, airfield construction. The concept of radar itself was known to Japanese scientists in theoretical terms, but the empire's industrial base, starved for resources and compartmentalized by inter-service rivalries, had made little progress beyond coastal surveillance installations. The idea that Americans could manufacture radar sets compact enough for fighter aircraft, produce them in quantities sufficient to equip entire squadrons, and deploy them operationally to forward combat zones was beyond the conceptual framework of Japanese strategic planning. It contradicted everything they had observed about American material culture, a soft, luxury-addicted society that could produce automobiles and refrigerators, but lacked the martial discipline for breakthrough military technology. This catastrophic intelligence failure rested on a philosophical error that permeated Japanese strategic thinking. The belief that technology without spirit was hollow, that American industrial capacity was vast but shallow, that the mass-produced output of Detroit and Pittsburgh could never match the crafted excellence of Japanese engineering married to samurai discipline. Japanese officers looked at American abundance and saw decadence. They looked at American standardization and saw weakness. They looked at American production line methodologies and saw proof that Americans built quantities of adequate equipment rather than small numbers of superior weapons. This worldview was not irrational. It was supported by early war evidence, by the poor performance of American fighters like the Brewster Buffalo, by the organizational chaos of American forces in the Philippines, by the material profligacy of American logistics that seemed to prioritize comfort over combat effectiveness. What this worldview could not accommodate was the possibility that American abundance itself was a form of technological superiority, that the capacity to produce 10,000 adequate radar sets was strategically superior to the capacity to produce 100 excellent ones, that standardization enabled rapid training and replacement, that the industrial democracy of American manufacturing culture generated innovation through collaboration rather than hierarchical genius. The Japanese looked at American radar and, when they finally encountered it, saw it as a trick, an aberration, a temporary advantage that superior spirit would overcome. They never understood that they were experiencing the logical endpoint of two incompatible industrial philosophies meeting in mortal combat. The transformation began in increments, each one barely noticed until the accumulated weight became undeniable. In February 1943, a Japanese bomber formation approaching Guadalcanal lost 3 aircraft to night fighters under conditions of total overcast, no moon, no stars, no possibility of visual interception. The survivors reported their losses to American anti-aircraft fire because anti-aircraft fire was a known, understandable threat. In March, 5 more bombers failed to return from night missions over New Georgia, their final radio transmissions cut off mid-word as if they had flown into an invisible wall. In April, the nightly bombing raids that had terrorized Henderson Field for 8 months simply stopped, because Japanese commanders could no longer justify the losses against the negligible damage being inflicted. The pattern was consistent and inexplicable. American night fighters were appearing exactly where Japanese bombers were flying, in weather conditions that made visual navigation impossible, at altitudes and headings that suggested the Americans knew precisely where to look. Japanese aviators began reporting strange American aircraft behavior fighters that approached from astern in total darkness, that maneuvered into firing positions without overshooting or losing contact, that broke off after shooting down their target, as if they could see the falling wreckage confirm the kill. Some pilots reported seeing unusual antenna arrays on American fighters photographed during daylight encounters, but these reports were dismissed by intelligence officers as visual misidentification or combat stress. The truth remained locked in the experience of men who did not survive to report it. Lieutenant Yamamoto, spiraling toward the Solomon Sea with his wing sheared off by cannon fire, died without understanding that he had been tracked for 12 minutes by electromagnetic pulses his eyes could not see. Commander Saito Hiroshi, whose formation lost 4 bombers over Bougainville on a moonless night in May, attributed the losses to uncannily accurate American searchlights, because searchlights were a technology that fit his conceptual framework. Flight Petty Officer Nakamura Kenji, one of the rare survivors of a radar-guided night intercept, described his experience as being attacked by invisible demons who struck from empty air a report that earned him psychiatric evaluation rather than tactical analysis. The psychological weight of these encounters accumulated like sediment. Japanese bomber crews, once confident in their nocturnal invulnerability, began developing the superstitious behaviors of men fighting forces they cannot comprehend. They flew higher, reducing bombing accuracy, but increasing the distance from which American fighters might attack. They varied their routes obsessively, hoping to confuse an enemy whose knowledge seemed supernatural. They reduced formation integrity, gambling that dispersed aircraft would present fewer targets, not understanding that radar made each individual bomber equally visible. Some crews refused night missions entirely, accepting courts-martial rather than launching into darkness that had become haunted. By summer 1943, the night sky over the Solomons had inverted its allegiance. American night fighters F-6F Hellcats and F-4U Corsairs, equipped with increasingly sophisticated radar variants, guided by ground controllers using shipboard search radar, Coordinated through radio networks, the Japanese could not effectively jam patrolled with the confident aggression Japanese aviators had once claimed as their exclusive domain. The ghost flights ended not with a dramatic battle, but with a statistical extinction. Replacement crews stopped arriving from Rabaul. Spare parts ran out. Attrition ground Japanese night bombing capabilities into operational irrelevance. By September, Henderson Field slept through darkness undisturbed except by the occasional solo nuisance raid, and even those stopped after the last two pilots foolish enough to attempt them were killed on successive nights by radar-guided fighters they never saw. The symbolic weight of this transformation extended far beyond tactical aviation. For the Japanese military establishment, aerial combat represented the purest expression of national character translated into modern warfare: individual skill, spiritual discipline, acceptance of death as the price of honor, victory through superior moral fiber over materialist opponents. The Zero fighter, with its extreme range and maneuverability, purchased at the cost of pilot protection, embodied this philosophy perfectly, a weapon that demanded excellence from its operator and rewarded that excellence with dominance. That such a philosophy could be defeated not by superior American fighting spirit, but by a black box of electronics that allowed mediocre pilots to kill expert ones, was a conceptual wound that cut deeper than any battlefield defeat. American radar, from the Japanese perspective, was cheating. It was the mechanical crutch of a society that lacked the discipline to develop true warrior skills, the technological equivalent of a rich man hiring samurai rather than training himself in the sword. That such cheating could prove strategically decisive was an affront to the entire ideological foundation of Japanese militarism. It suggested that Bushido, for all its spiritual purity, could be rendered obsolete by engineering. It implied that American material culture, the assembly lines, the standardized training, the doctrine of overwhelming force through industrial capacity, represented a form of warfare that Japanese martial excellence could not overcome through spirit alone. This realization arrived not as sudden enlightenment, but as a slow, corrosive awareness that seeped through the ranks of Japanese aviation. Pilots who survived encounters with radar-equipped American fighters described the experience in terms usually reserved for natural disasters or divine intervention forces beyond human control or comprehension. The Americans had somehow stolen night itself, transformed darkness from Japan's ally into Japan's executioner, and there was no counter to it, no tactical innovation that could restore the balance, because you cannot outmaneuver or outfight an enemy who knows your exact position while you remain blind. The only effective response would have been a Japanese radar development program of equal sophistication, and by 1943 such a program was impossible, not because Japanese scientists lacked the theoretical knowledge, but because Japan's shrinking industrial base could not support the production infrastructure required. The recurring symbol of this technological asymmetry was not a weapon or a tool, but a sound. The high-pitched whine of American radar transmissions, just barely audible to Japanese aircrews as a faint interference pattern in their radio receivers. Some pilots reported hearing this sound in the final minutes before night fighter attacks, a ghost frequency that preceded death like the rustle of wings. Others claimed they could sense radar beams painting their aircraft, a tingling sensation at the base of the skull, a psychosomatic manifestation of prey instinct screaming, warnings the conscious mind could not process. Whether these reports were accurate or apocryphal became irrelevant. The sound of American radar, real or imagined, became the auditory signature of technological obsolescence, the death rattle of an empire that had bet its survival on human excellence and lost to machine precision. The operational evidence of radar's impact, accumulated in captured Japanese documents studied after the war after-action reports that described American night fighters with terminology suggesting supernatural rather than technological capability, intelligence summaries that struggled to explain how American pilots achieved intercept rates impossible under visual conditions, interrogation transcripts of captured bomber crews whose descriptions of their final missions read like ghost stories. One particularly revealing document, a tactical analysis circulated among Japanese bomber units in October 1943, recommended avoiding night operations entirely unless conditions of absolute necessity justified the expected loss rates. The analysis included a mathematical section calculating that Japanese bomber formations could expect 30–40% casualties per mission in areas patrolled by radar-equipped American fighters' loss rates that would eliminate an entire air group within 2 weeks of sustained operations. This was extinction through mathematics. The Japanese Empire, its industrial capacity already strangled by American submarine interdiction, its pilot training programs depleted by years of attrition, its aviation fuel stockpiles dwindling toward crisis, could not absorb loss rates of this magnitude. Each bomber shot down represented not just 7 dead crewmen, but hundreds of hours of manufacturing labor, thousands of gallons of irreplaceable aviation fuel, months of training time for replacement crews who grew progressively less skilled as veteran instructors, died and training time shortened. American radar transformed aerial combat from a contest of skill into a contest of industrial endurance. And industrial endurance was a contest the United States had already won, before the first radar scope was installed in the first night fighter. The broader implications cascaded through Japanese strategic planning. If night bombing was no longer viable, American forward airfields became invulnerable to air attack. If American fighters could hunt effectively in total darkness, the protective cover of night that allowed Japanese resupply missions to besieged garrisons evaporated. If radar-equipped American aircraft could vector onto Japanese formations with precision, the massed bomber formations that were Japan's only effective striking tool became suicide missions. The technological asymmetry in night fighting capability created a cascading series of operational impossibilities that constrained Japanese options, forced concentration of air power into defensive roles, and handed strategic initiative to American forces who could now operate around the clock without fear of effective retaliation. Yet the Japanese military establishment struggled to acknowledge these implications because acknowledging them required admitting that the fundamental assumptions of Japanese strategic culture were obsolete. The idea that American technological advantages could be permanent rather than temporary, that American production capacity represented qualitative rather than merely quantitative superiority, that American combat effectiveness derived from systemic industrial military integration rather than individual valor, these concepts contradicted 2 generations of military indoctrination. Senior Japanese officers continued to attribute their declining fortunes to bad luck, temporary setbacks, insufficient fighting spirit among junior ranks, anything except the structural reality that Japan was fighting a 20th century industrial war with 19th century military philosophy. The psychological cost of this cognitive dissonance fell hardest on the aviators who experienced it directly. Japanese pilots, raised in a culture that venerated air combat as modern samurai warfare, found themselves reduced to target practice for American pilots they never saw. The honor-bound warrior ethos that sustained them through combat stress, that justified their acceptance of death, that gave meaning to their sacrifice, required that death come through heroic combat against a visible enemy. To be killed by a machine, by a pilot who might be inferior in skill but superior in equipment, by electronics that reduced aerial combat to tracking a glowing dot on a screen, this was not the death of a warrior, but the death of a component in an industrial process. It was death stripped of meaning, reduced to statistics, processed through American material abundance like grain through a mill. The epilogue to this technological revolution came not in a single decisive battle, but in the accumulated silence of missions that never launched, of aircraft that remained grounded, because sending them into darkness had become indistinguishable from executing their crews. By 1944, Japanese night operations over American-controlled territories had effectively ceased. The nightly bombing raids that had terrorized Guadalcanal in 1942, that had forced American forces to sleep in foxholes and operate under constant threat of nocturnal attack, had been replaced by a situation where American aircraft flew night combat air patrols over Japanese bases, hunted Japanese shipping through darkness, conducted nocturnal photo reconnaissance missions with impunity. The night, which had begun the war as Japan's strategic asset, had become America's private hunting preserve. This inversion was powered by thousands of radar sets produced in American factories, installed in American aircraft, operated by American pilots whose training had been accelerated by radar's simplification of night intercept procedures. The same industrial culture that produced automobiles and refrigerators in peacetime had retooled to produce radar-guided fighters at rates that overwhelmed Japanese production capacity by orders of magnitude. By war's end, American factories had manufactured approximately 50,000 radar sets for airborne applications, a number representing more total radar units than Japan produced for all military purposes combined throughout the entire war. This was the quantitative expression of qualitative superiority. Abundance deployed with precision, mass production married to technological sophistication, democratic capitalism weaponized into an instrument that made Japanese martial philosophy strategically irrelevant. The deeper truth that radar revealed was not about technology per se, but about the incompatibility of two social systems translated into military competition. Japanese aviation excellence rested on a foundation of individual craftsmanship, intensive training, hierarchical discipline, and acceptance of sacrifice, a model that produced superlative results from small numbers of elite practitioners. American aviation effectiveness rested on standardization, mass production, systematic training, and technological force multiplication, a model that produced adequate results from enormous numbers of average practitioners equipped with superior tools. In peacetime, these competing models might have coexisted. In total war, the American model scaled in ways the Japanese model could not match. Every Japanese pilot killed represented an irreplaceable loss of accumulated expertise. Every American pilot killed was replaced by 3 more, each equipped with radar sets that partially compensated for their lack of experience. The final irony was that Japanese scientists understood radar's theoretical principles perfectly well. Japanese universities had conducted electromagnetic wave research throughout the 1,930 seconds. Japanese military laboratories had developed radar prototypes that, in laboratory conditions, performed comparably to early Allied systems. What Japan lacked was not knowledge but industrial infrastructure, the capacity to manufacture vacuum tubes in sufficient quantities, to miniaturize components for airborne installation, to train technicians in repair and maintenance, to integrate radar into doctrine and tactics and training programs across entire air forces. This was not a failure of Japanese ingenuity, but a failure of Japanese industrial modernity. The society that had bet its future on warrior spirit confronted the reality that modern warfare was decided not by the sharpness of swords, but by the depth of factory capacity. And so the night skies over the Pacific, once dominated by Japanese pilots who navigated by stars and struck from darkness like avenging ghosts, fell silent, except for the whisper of American radar pulses, invisible electromagnetic whispers that said more clearly than any propaganda broadcast or battlefield victory that the age of individual heroism had been supplanted by the age of industrial systems, that Bushido had been rendered obsolete by engineering, that the future belonged not to those who embraced death, but to those who mass-produced life-saving technology faster than their enemies could mass-produce death. Lieutenant Yamamoto, falling toward the Solomon Sea in his burning bomber, understood none of this in explicit terms, but in the 3 seconds between the first tracer rounds and the moment his aircraft exploded, he understood the essential truth. The Americans had learned to see in the dark, and they had told no one, because the darkness now belonged to them. That understanding, multiplied across thousands of Japanese air crews who died without comprehending how they had been found, constitutes the hidden narrative of the Pacific War's aerial campaign, not the dramatic dogfights that filled after-action reports, but the silent elimination of Japan's nocturnal advantage by a technology most Japanese pilots never knew existed until it killed them. The green glow of American radar scopes, phosphorescent eyes staring through darkness and clouds and night itself, represented more than tactical advantage. They represented the weaponization of American abundance, the systematic application of industrial democracy to warfare, the proof that freedom's material prosperity could be transformed into strategic dominance through superior systems integration. Every Japanese pilot killed by radar-guided night fighters died not just from bullets and cannon shells, but from the accumulated weight of American factory production, electrical engineering expertise, training infrastructure, and a military-industrial complex that treated technology as a replaceable commodity rather than a carefully crafted artifact. In the end, the Japanese pilots never knew. They died confused, attributing their losses to bad luck or superior American numbers, or the inevitable fortunes of war. The truth that they had been systematically hunted by machines they could not perceive, that their martial excellence had been neutralized by engineering they did not understand, that the darkness which had protected them had been stolen by electromagnetic waves. This truth was too alien to their worldview to be comprehensible even as it killed them. They fell from night skies, believing they had been defeated by American courage or American numbers, never understanding that they had been defeated by American oscilloscopes and vacuum tubes and assembly line production techniques that churned out radar sets, like Detroit churned out automobiles. The green glow of those radar scopes, pulsing in American cockpits across the Pacific darkness, was the light of modernity itself, impersonal, systemic, irresistible, and under that light, the samurai spirit of Japanese aviation, for all its discipline and courage and willingness to die, proved as fragile as flesh against steel, as outdated as cavalry against machine guns, as doomed as any warrior ethos confronting an enemy who had learned to make war not with heroes but with systems. The Americans had not merely defeated Japanese night operations, they had rendered the entire concept of human night fighting skill obsolete, replaced warrior expertise with technological capability, and demonstrated that in modern war, the side with superior industrial capacity would always triumph over the side with superior individual skill. That lesson, written in the trajectories of burning Japanese bombers falling from radar-vectored ambushes, would echo through military history long after the last veteran of the Pacific War had died. The age of the warrior had ended in darkness over the Solomon Sea, killed not by a more skilled enemy, but by a more systematic one, not by superior courage, but by superior production, not by the bullet, but by the factory that made 10,000 bullets per hour. And the Japanese pilots, trained since childhood to value honor above survival and spirit above material, never knew what killed them, until the moment the tracers materialized from empty night, and the darkness they had trusted betrayed them to the green glow of American eyes that could see everything, everywhere, all at once. The radar scope pulsed, the pip grew brighter, and the night, ancient and eternal, surrendered its last secrets to the engineers of abundance.